Hyaluronic acid is becoming extremely popular. It is often done poorly, complications arise, or the patient is dissatisfied and wants to dissolve the filler. However, this is where a problem arises. After such dissolution, the skin can look much worse than before the procedure. In this video, I will explain why the skin looks worse, how to wisely dissolve hyaluronic acid, and how to perform procedures so as not to cause yourself problems. My name is Monika Wijwa and I am an aesthetic medicine doctor from Krakow. When it comes to hyaluronidase, I have to admit that I have an issue with it. Why? When browsing the offers of aesthetic clinics, you'll come across treatments with hyaluronic acid. Patients often choose lip augmentation and facial volumetry, mainly because they read that the effects of such procedures can be easily reversed. How? For such a filler, for example, in the lips, you can inject hyaluronidase and get rid of it completely. Hyaluronidase is a special enzyme that dissolves the filler from the tissues. So what does that mean? Does it mean that since there's hyaluronidase, you can get as many injections as you want because it can always be reversed? It all sounds wonderful, but unfortunately that's not the case. There are many issues that raise concerns when it comes to the use of hyaluronidase. First of all, on this channel, I've seen hundreds of comments from you viewers where you wrote that after hyaluronidase, the skin isn't the same as before, that it's loose, of poor quality, and sagging, damaging. Secondly, physics. That is, if a filler is injected into the tissues, then, in simple terms, it will stretch the skin, and removing it will have the same effect as when you let the air out of a balloon and it becomes deflated. Thirdly, the destruction of your own hyaluronic acid. And here again, just using common sense. If the body naturally produces its own hyaluronic acid, which is important and necessary, and we inject something that is meant to destroy it, are we actually harming our youth just to look like monsters in 20 years? In this video, I will answer all these questions, but to do that, we first need to talk about what hyaluronidase actually is. Hyaluronidase is one of over 75,000 enzymes found in the human body. Enzymes are biological catalysts, complex three-dimensional proteins that carry out very specific chemical reactions. At the molecular level, each enzyme carries out only one strictly defined chemical reaction for which the keys fit exclusively to its unique protein shape. So, what does that mean in plain Polish? You can compare hyaluronidase to a pair of scissors designed to cut only one specific type of string. Imagine that in our body there are many different strings, meaning substances like hyaluronic acid, and each pair of scissors, that is, each enzyme, can cut only one of them and no other. Hyaluronidase is exactly this kind of specialized pair of scissors that can cut only one string made of hyaluronic acid, breaking it down into smaller fragments. In aesthetic medicine, we most often use hyaluronidase of animal origin. It's worth adding that hyaluronidase had been used in medicine long before people started filling wrinkles with acid. For example, it is used to speed up the absorption of drugs administered subcutaneously because it increases tissue permeability by breaking down hyaluronic acid and reducing the viscosity of the extracellular matrix. And in ophthalmology, for example, it is added to local anesthetics to help them penetrate better. The mechanism of action always comes down to the same thing. By breaking down hyaluronic acid, the enzyme hyaluronidase loosens the structure of the extracellular matrix and reduces the viscosity of tissue fluids, which increases tissue permeability. However, hyaluronidase administered not for medical purposes but for aesthetic reasons raises a lot of controversy. Why? Because it can worsen the appearance of the face. And this isn't just speculation but concrete research that you need to know about. In 2024, new studies on dissolving fillers with hyaluronidase were published. As many as 90 patients were examined after the dissolving procedure. It was observed that about 18% of them experienced undesirable changes in facial appearance, referred to as post-procedure syndrome after hyaluronidase. That 18% is a lot. The authors of this study believe that this dissatisfaction is related to excessive loss of volume, loss of firmness in the upper face, and deepening of wrinkles after the dissolving procedure. However, what the authors stated is important. These affected patients are mainly people who had large amounts of filler for a very long time. The analysis showed a strong correlation between the risk of an undesirable effect and both the volume and duration of the previous filler. Interestingly, the analysis showed no correlation with the dose of hyaluronidase used for dissolution. So according to these studies, it wasn't the amount of hyaluronidase administered that mattered, but rather the patient's initial situation and the condition of the tissues before the dissolution procedure. So can we actually say that hyaluronidase damages tissues? Perhaps so. And that's why I have to tell you about the observations of one of the plastic surgeons. While preparing for this film, I came across a very interesting material by Dr. Gavinichana. He interviewed Dr. Bentale, a plastic surgeon who had the opportunity to see tissues from the inside, previously treated with hyaluronidase during lip lift procedures. Anyway, listen for yourself to what his observations are. A moment for explanation. Dr. Talley suggests that the SMS layer, tissue that has previously undergone a hyaluronidase procedure, looks and behaves differently than healthy tissue. The SMS layer, or the superficial musculopolyneurotic system, is a layer of tissue under the facial skin that connects the facial muscles and the skin.
Let us continue to pay close attention and remain fully engaged with the ongoing presentation. Therefore, it is imperative that we maintain our focus and prepare ourselves for the subsequent information that will be shared, ensuring we do not miss any crucial details or developments as we proceed.
Dr. Bentalay suggested that in patients who had their fillers dissolved, he noticed during a facelift that the SMS layer seemed to have lost volume and moisture at the site where hyaluronidase was administered. However, there is no solid scientific evidence confirming that it is hyaluronidase that permanently alters the SMS. I want to emphasize, though, that apart from this source, I have not found any solid scientific evidence in the form of studies that would precisely discuss this topic. Therefore, the observations of a single doctor are not equivalent to a consensus, and the fact that there are no studies on this topic yet does not mean that if there were, they would definitely align with his observations. In this case, we are relying solely on the personal experience of the doctor and on a specific group of patients after a lip lift procedure, which leads to a sampling bias. Additionally, we are relying on the confirmation effect, that is, the tendency to look for evidence that supports a preconceived theory during clinical practice. Therefore, the only fair conclusion is that more research is needed. Speaking of research, the matter does not end here. The SMAS layer is not the only layer in the tissues that hyaluronidase can affect. We need to clearly answer the question of whether hyaluronidase destroys and dissolves anything other than hyaluronic acid, for example, collagen or elastin. Does hyaluronidase damage tissues? To answer that, I need to go back to my example from the beginning of the video about what hyaluronidase actually does. It works like scissors that can only cut one specific type of string, and that string is hyaluronic acid. For this reason, hyaluronidase does not directly damage collagen, elastin, or other structural proteins of the skin, so in theory, it should not degrade the skin's framework. I'll also go back to the studies in which 18% of patients were dissatisfied after the use of hyaluronidase. In these studies, the authors concluded that this dissatisfaction did not result from hyaluronidase damaging the tissues. It was about something else. According to the authors, the tissues collapsed after the removal of a large amount of filler to which they had become accustomed. But that's not all. There are other very interesting studies by Dr. Saboni which talk about the fact that these are doses. Hyaluronidase, it depends on how the skin will look shortly after using this enzyme. So the more hyaluronidase, the worse the skin looks after the dissolving procedure. But is it permanent? The answer is no. Listen for yourselves to what the author of the study has to say about this.
When you swell up, you almost completely lose all of the tension in your face, making it appear quite different. That means you not only destroyed what you had put in, but you also destroyed something that was there before.
Exactly. But does the fact that the skin looks worse after the procedure mean that hyaluronidase dissolves our natural hyaluronic acid? Unfortunately, yes. However, before I talk about dissolving natural hyaluronic acid, I have some important information for you. Right now, completely free, you can join my 5 Days to Better Skin Challenge. In it, I show you how to wisely take care of your appearance without any aesthetic procedures, using only home and free methods. So I show you how to look better without hyaluronic acid and without hyaluronidase. That's why, by joining the challenge, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Check out the link in the description and join my free challenge. Does hyaluronidase dissolve the natural hyaluronic acid produced by the body? Hyaluronidase does not distinguish between hyaluronic acid from fillers and the natural one produced in our skin. Its action does not involve cutting the chains of the hyaluronic acid molecule into smaller fragments. So if the enzyme is injected into the tissue, it will break down both the excess filler and some of our own hyaluronic acid present in that area. It sounds alarming, but only until we understand how the body naturally produces hyaluronic acid. But how is that possible? That when we use hyaluronidase and locally dissolve all the acid, including the natural one, the skin eventually returns to normal. How quickly does the body produce natural hyaluronic acid, and how long does this acid last in the body? We often think of the natural hyaluronic acid in our bodies as something we are given once at birth, and then we just lose it over time. However, the truth is completely different. Just as our nails or hair grow, we are constantly naturally producing and breaking down hyaluronic acid. According to research, the natural lifespan of hyaluronic acid, that is, the time after which half of its molecules break down, is about 24 hours. This means that within a day, half of the hyaluronic acid in the skin will be replaced by new acid. In other words, there is a constant exchange taking place. It is estimated that a person weighing 70 kilograms has about 15 grams of hyaluronic acid distributed throughout their body, of which about 5 grams, that is 1/3 of the total, is broken down and newly synthesized every day. And that's a huge amount. Imagine that every day the body processes 5 grams of hyaluronic acid so that the tissues can maintain their balance. The highest concentration of hyaluronic acid is found in the skin. It is estimated that about half of all the hyaluronic acid in the body is actually in the skin, but it is also found in the joints, eyes, and connective tissue. However, you might be surprised when I tell you that among all these different places where hyaluronic acid is present, it actually stays in the skin for a shorter time than, for example, in the joint cartilage. And that means it requires constant renewal. Fortunately, fibroblasts in the skin are constantly producing it. As a result, even if we lose some hyaluronic acid, whether naturally or, for example, as a result of injecting hyaluronidase, the body will make up for it in a short time. What conclusion can we draw from this? Since hyaluronic acid naturally breaks down in the body and new acid is produced in cycles that last about 24 hours, dissolving a bit more with hyaluronidase is not something the body can't handle. The continuous production and breakdown of hyaluronic acid is a normal physiological process in our bodies. This is also confirmed by the opinion of Dr. Saboni, who studied the effect of dissolving filler on the skin. Listen for yourselves.
The only explanation I can find is in 24 hours. If you have a depression in the area where I injected some liquid, something happened. So I think depending on the amount you're injecting, and I would say over 150 units, you already have an effect within hours and days in the human body. And it makes a difference right away, but then it is restored within 48 hours.
However, we still haven't answered a very important question. Is it true that the filler injected stretches the skin and removing it causes an effect like letting the air out of a balloon? The matter seems obvious. When the filler is injected into the skin, it stretches it. And when we dissolve this acid, the skin becomes flaccid because there is empty space in the tissues. Just like when you let the air out of a balloon. But is it really that simple? Not quite. The skin is a human organ, like the liver or heart. The skin can naturally stretch and contract without being damaged. Otherwise, it would tear at every possible opportunity. For example, when we do the splits or even change our weight by just a kilogram. Exactly, this example of change is quite apt because if such changes are very sudden, visible alterations can appear on the skin. And I'm talking about stretch marks here. But you probably know from your own experience that stretch marks only appear when changes happen very quickly. For example, during pregnancy, it's similar with hyaluronic acid. Both injecting it and removing it with hyaluronidase do not cause changes in the skin structure, assuming reasonable amounts are used. What are these reasonable amounts? I think we can assume that it's a few and not, for example, a dozen or so milliliters for a given area of the face. This means that after the filler is dissolved, the skin ultimately returns to its original shape. We do not observe dramatic sagging or excess skin in such patients. Our skin contains collagen and elastin fibers, which give it elasticity. They are able to adapt to slight changes in volume and then contract again. However, if we are talking about extreme cases, meaning many milliliters of acid in a small area, for example, in the lips, adding this acid over the years and then suddenly dissolving it with hyaluronidase, this can lead to a sudden collapse and laxity effect. However, while you probably don't need to worry about sagging after dissolving the acid, there is still one more topic we absolutely need to discuss. Since the body produces natural hyaluronic acid, and we use fillers and sometimes hyaluronidase, what will happen after 20 or 30 years of such procedures? Will we end up looking like wax figures? Will the natural production of the acid slow down? In this video, I mentioned several times that we have natural hyaluronic acid in our bodies, but that it breaks down. However, I haven't yet explained why it breaks down. In other words, what causes this natural breakdown? And here I have a surprise for you. The removal of hyaluronic acid from the body is handled by natural hyaluronidase. Yes, we also produce hyaluronidase ourselves. That's why even after a successful procedure with a filler, the effects don't last forever. Importantly, hyaluronidase plays a role not only in the metabolism of hyaluronic acid in the skin, but also in wound healing and tissue remodeling, and even in the process of fertilization. Sperm secrete hyaluronidase to break through the hyaluronic acid-rich layer surrounding the egg cell. So since we produce hyaluronidase ourselves and live just fine, a controlled dose of extra hyaluronidase won't suddenly turn us into monsters. So, does that mean hyaluronic acid itself will turn us into monsters? The honest answer is it might, but it doesn't have to. That strange and artificial look doesn't come from hyaluronidase or from reasonable amounts of hyaluronic acid. You actually have to make a real effort to achieve that, and I talk about the whole issue in this video. Save it for later. Many times here on the channel, I've read your comments that after hyaluronidase, your skin looked worse. However, after this video, it turns out that dissatisfaction with the appearance of your skin after such a procedure can have several causes, which I will now summarize. First of all, because the skin is still healing and you're fresh out of the procedure, meaning there's swelling and extra volume that will subside. Studies confirm that in the first hours after the procedure, the skin will look worse. Secondly, because the patient has lost volume that used to stretch the skin, meaning the supporting filler is gone. Thirdly, because the patient was used to their previous appearance. Here's a real-life example. When he was young, my husband had his arm in a cast for several weeks. When they took it off, because it was no longer comfortable or necessary, Dominic felt strange without the cast. In the same way, you might feel strange after removing the filler, which was no longer needed but was there. Fourth, because the patient compares themselves to how they looked years ago before any procedures, but time has passed and during that time the skin may have aged in other ways. Fifth, because the patient experiences the effect of stretched skin, which, as we've established, concerns the rapid dissolution of large amounts of filler, for example, a dozen or so milliliters in a given area. And finally, sixth, why might the skin look worse after hyaluronidase, the nocebo effect? The nocebo effect is essentially the opposite of the placebo effect, meaning that a patient considering hyaluronidase reads about it online, sees other patients' opinions on how hyaluronidase worsened their skin, and then, when undergoing the procedure themselves, expects the same outcome. The nocebo effect is the opposite of seeing things through rose-colored glasses, and it means that if you expect negative outcomes, that's exactly what you get, and you become overly aware if something on your face looks worse. So, what can we conclude from this? To answer the question of what hyaluronidase does to the skin, you can't just discuss individual cases or comments found online. For example, just like there might be an old lady who is 110 years old and smokes cigarettes, but that doesn't mean cigarettes are healthy. That's why if you're already undergoing a hyaluronidase treatment, I'll now give you specific steps on what to do if your skin feels loose. What should you do if your skin feels loose after hyaluronidase? First of all, give yourself time. Don't make a final judgment about the results of the dissolving procedure within the first 2 weeks after the treatment. As you know from this video, it takes time for the skin to return to normal and for natural hyaluronic acid to regenerate. Secondly, if your skin is still looser after this period, consider, for example, tissue stimulators to help firm it up. Thirdly, you can use a filler again, because using hyaluronic acid doesn't always mean that the filler was unnecessary, or that it was administered without reason. So, for example, the fact that there was too much of it, or there was a complication or it migrated, doesn't mean that if it were administered properly and in reasonable amounts, it wouldn't have served its function perfectly, because hyaluronic acid itself is not bad. But if in a given treatment area it would be beneficial to have well-applied hyaluronic acid, then it can be used again. How soon? 4 weeks after the procedure. Despite all the knowledge you've gained from this video, there's still one more thing you need to know. Hyaluronic acid fillers, the ones that haven't dissolved, remain in the body much longer than was once thought. Studies show that it can even be several years. So if you're considering hyaluronic acid and aesthetic procedures, check out the video that's now appearing on the screen. In it, I explain what consequences arise from the fact that the acid, instead of lasting 1 or 2 years, remains in the tissues much longer. I also have a huge heartfelt request. If you found this video interesting, please leave me a comment below for better reach. That way, YouTube will show it to more people. Thank you for that and for watching my videos. See you in the next one. Kisses!